If you haven't downloaded the world's first provincial election betting app, you need to ask yourself, why haven't I downloaded the world's first provincial election betting app? The new Manitoba Provincial Election Armchair Prognosticator betting app from the Winnipeg Free Press is a total game changer. With our new Space AG app, you can bet on which candidates will win, by how many votes, and whether the CBC will make the wrong election prediction before all the votes are counted. But what if you want to make a bet while people are still voting? You can do that. Seriously. When the ballot boxes are finally cracked open, you can create a whole new parlay. How many spoiled ballots? How long did people have to wait in line to vote? Did the Keystone Party somehow manage to get a single vote in Point Douglas? It's all right here, right in the palm of your hand. The Free Press Manitoba Provincial Election Armchair Prognosticator app is waiting for you. It's time to get in the game.
Terms and conditions apply. Election wagers only valid for users in Manitoba. Please prognosticate responsibly. Wagering on sports or elections is stupid. Know your limits. If you or a loved one have an obsession with politics or gambling, perhaps it's time to get a new hobby. Please note, app is purely fictional.
The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Niigaan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome everybody to a special episode of Niigaan and the Lone Ranger podcast. This week we decided to go directly at the question that's on everybody's mind related to the provincial election. So you're going to interrupt me right away, so just go for it.
Well, I was about to say that, we've been talking about it. It's like we've been dancing around the fire for weeks. And now we're just going to jump right in the fire.
Into the fire.
That's right, we're jumping right in.
Yeah, okay. So this is the 2023 provincial election handicap special, where we're bringing in pundits to support your podcast hosts to so that we can actually try to, at least at this point, try to offer our best forecasts, our best guesses as to what's going to happen in the 2023 election, which must take place no later than October 3rd. So joining us to help out, Chris Adams is an adjunct professor, political studies department at the University of Manitoba. Chris.
Yep.
How's it going?
Nice to be here, Dan.
Good.
And Niigaan, nice to see you.
Yeah, it's nice to see you not in a committee meeting at the university. So.
That is correct.
Curtis Brown is a principal at Probe Research, who is Probe Research is the polling partner of the Winnipeg Free Press. As an aside, if you have to do polling in 2023, try Probe Research. Polling to the...
No one is a better partner.
Polling to the media of record. Curtis, welcome to the...
Thanks for having me.
And if you like the little blurb, tell Scott he can buy an ad on the podcast. We're doing that anytime.
Sounds good. We'll get right on that.
So, quick word about... We had to come up with a methodology such as it is because we have 57 ridings. And if we spent 2 minutes talking about every riding... we would have an all-time long...
No one would listen about minute 30, and it would just go on forever.
Okay.
So what we decided to do instead was compile our illustrious panelists and your ideas of riding by riding where things would go. And so we made this massive spreadsheet. And I, of course, came in at the end having not done my homework very well. And
your
so
mother called to say that she's heard this story before. So.
My dog ate my homework.
Yes, okay.
Actually, I was more like, do I want to spend part of my life doing this? But anyways, And so here we are. We've compiled everything according to our pundits who have a great deal of insider knowledge of each riding. And then what we did on top of that was look at the safe seats, and then what are the seats kind of up in the air, up for grabs. And then I think that generally what we're going to spend is the most amount of time talking about those toss-up seats. But it's worth covering, that when we initially did the compiling of our panelists, it was interesting that it kind of came down to about 20 safe seats on both the NDP and the Conservatives. And that's interesting. I mean, that's interesting because it shows you that there's kind of a block vote on each side, and then there's a lot of mushy middle.
Well, I guess you could say there's kind of a mob mentality about this. And so I'll just give you very quickly, and just for listeners, this compilation will be available in addition to my column. I'm going to write a column about this. It will appear today, the day that the podcast is also dropped. So what we came down to was 21 safe NDP seats, 20 safe Progressive Conservative seats, and 3 safe Liberal seats.
If you think of Manitoba, when you look at the ridings, like the far north or the north above the Interlake, that's really the safe area for the NDP. And historically speaking, the north of Winnipeg. So I always think of the two norths, right? And then for the Progressive Conservatives, generally speaking, the south part of Manitoba and the south part of the city historically was Progressive Conservative. So when I looked at your 57 riding list, I look at where do they fit into the two norths, right. Urban north and rural north, and rural south and urban south. So that sort of, when we talk about the safe seats in Manitoba, in many ways they kind of lock into those two norths and the two souths that belong to each of the parties.
Of the 21 safe seats for the NDP, and this is more or less the consensus of the pundit panel, the handicap panel, Assiniboia, Brandon East, Burroughs, Concordia, Elmwood, Flin Flon, Fort Garry, Fort Rouge, Kiwatanuk, the Maples, McPhillips, Notre Dame, Point Douglas, St. James, St. John's, St. Vital, the Pas, Kimisek, Thompson, Transcona, Union Station, Wolseley.
Pretty good on pronunciation. Not bad.
Not bad.
Kiwatanuk,
yeah,
and Kamisak.
Okay. Niigaan
Yes.
is going to read the Tories so I don't make any more pronunciation problems. But surprisingly, the Tory seats are all safe seats are all easy to pronounce.
I know this. I'm not going to comment any further on that. Okay. The 20 safe seats for the Conservatives are Agassiz, Borderland, Fort White, La Vérendrye, Lac de Bonnie, Lakeside, Midland, Morden Winkler, Portage la Prairie, Red River North, Riding Mountain, Roblin, Springfield, Richow?
You're doing that on purpose.
Spruce Woods, Steinbach, Swan River, Turtle Mountain, and Waverley.
And very quickly, for the sake of today, we're going to give the Liberals their 3 existing seats in River Heights, St. Boniface, and Tyndall Park. Correct.
Very, very generous of you, Dan.
Well, we all sort of did. Like there was a little wavering, but not much.
I'll refer back to my colleague Chris over there because when you're talking a little bit about the North, there are 2 Norths, and north of Winnipeg isn't always NDP. I mean, that first north of what you're talking about, I think we're talking about areas I grew up, frankly. I mean, the Interlake, Selkirk. I think some of those are perhaps up for grabs this time around, but certainly in the past have not been. I mean, we're even talking about pretty staunch former Reform Party areas in the Interlake and Selkirk particularly.
So there used to be Tom Peterson, who taught up until the mid-'80s at the University of Manitoba, but he draws a diagonal line across the Manitoba map. And as the PCs win, that diagonal line, which follows the Canadian Shield diagonal line, that goes north, and the PCs grab more of the Interlake and places like that. And as the NDP win, that diagonal line of the Canadian Shield line, that goes south. And so the NDP's north starts to expand into places like Gimli and things like that. So you're right. I'm not talking about the NDP area just being north of Winnipeg. It's that Canadian Shield line. And that line that really divides between PC and NDP.
Curtis, why don't you take us through and mention the list of swing seats, and then we'll sort of go into them one by one and talk about why we think these ones are toss-ups.
Yeah, well, there's a number of them. Most of them are in South Winnipeg. A few of them are outside the perimeter. So, Assiniboia, in West Winnipeg, Dauphin, in Western Manitoba, Dawson Trail, just kind of east of the city, Fort Richmond, Interlake Gimli, Kildone and River East, Kirkfield Park, La Jamodier, Radisson, Riel, Rossmere, Seine River, Selkirk, Southdale. I think in terms of making any of the list of seats that we're going to be looking at, these are the ones that we're really going to be watching over the next few months.
So the important thing to remember, and this goes back to past elections, is if the NDP are to achieve like a solid majority, landslide type majority, they would literally have to take all of these 14 seats. And the list that we gave you of the NDP safe seats includes 2 steals already that we think are pretty much done deals. So, like, I think when people who are predicting an easy route for the NDP to a majority, this is where you really start, when you separate them out, Curtis, you start to see, like, it's a really steep hill.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I would even start with some of the NDP safe seats. I don't know if I would define them as being as safe as maybe there's a bit, as maybe we agree on here, like Brandon East, McPhillips. I mean, those are some ones that maybe will be a little bit more difficult. Brandon East would be a pickup. But yeah, with some of these, the NDP definitely has to run the table almost to be able to get to that, low to mid 30s in terms of the number of seats. Otherwise, we're talking about either a minority or bare majority kind of a situation.
Yeah, and then, I mean, there's a lot of, on a riding by riding basis, there's a lot of things that you can't quite account for. The parties, Chris, the parties don't run the same campaign in every riding in terms of their resources and the intensity. They tend to move things around, depend on where they think they might have openings for gains, and they may abandon other seats all completely, which changes the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, where you see you have the safe ridings, you aren't going to pour a whole lot of critical resources into that. And the same thing for the ridings that are not going to support you. You don't put, and Curtis will know a lot about this. Like the polling data also show you where you put your resources. So, there's some ridings in which, well, let me back up. What the voter really votes on 3 choices. One is the leader. The leader is very prominent in terms of your voter choice. Secondly is the party and what the party stands for. And thirdly is the local candidate. So those 3 things come together as part of the collection of things that determine a voter's choice.
So, okay, so let's talk about the 3 toss-up seats that are outside Winnipeg. And I think that, you talked earlier, or maybe you can do it again just for posterity now, the diagonal line. When the NDP and the Tories, when their fortunes swing, how the diagonal line changes the electoral map in Manitoba.
So one of the things is Interlake Gimli, and the Interlake Gimli, I see that as being a bellwether for the province, and I see that being an NDP gain. Some of the other ones, I'm just quickly looking at my list here, is
Dauphin.
Is Dauphin. And Dauphin, I see a couple of us had said leaning towards the NDP. But anyway, I do see that line as being, when we look along that line, that's where the NDP will be making gains. But I want to hear about Brandon, if possible.
Brandon. Okay. Well,
that's your hometown.
Where I used to live and work for the Brandon Sun back in the day. Brandon East. I think that is traditionally an NDP seat, and one that the NDP probably have a pretty good chance of winning back. I don't think it's a slam dunk, though. I think that Brandon's changed demographically too, and they voted for Conservatives in that seat for the last 2 terms. And if we want to talk about before, Brandon West used to be a swing seat if you want to go way back, and I don't think it is. I don't see how it is. I mean, seems to be pretty staunchly, solidly conservative, and so I mean, again, this sort of speaks to what I was saying before, that the NDP, I think, will have some challenges picking up many seats in rural Manitoba, like rural, not northern, or not kind of in that, on the edge of that diagonal line part of Manitoba.
So, yeah, I think the key in Brandon East is, as it always is, good, strong E-Day for them. And they have to tape Drew Caldwell's thumbs to his hands so he can't tweet. So if they can do that, then I give them a solid chance of taking back Brandon East.
The other area that I think, and I know we'll talk about Winnipeg, but I think the south suburbs of Winnipeg, and that's going to be critical. But I'll wait till we get to that part of the discussion.
It's interesting because looking at the way that we looked at really those 3, I think, are Dauphin, Interlake Gimli, and then Selkirk. We all kind of were split on those 3 ridings, and generally, I think Dauphin, might be easier to call than Interlake Gimli and Selkirk but Selkirk has been for such a long period of time such a strong conservative riding, and quite soundly in the 2019 election, John Lagimodiere, but of course now there's no more Lagimodiere, and there may be winds of change. I mean, that was a long time NDP riding, but has not been NDP for a very, very long time as well.
Yeah, I would classify some of these seats a little bit differently too. Like I think Dauphin and Interlake Gimli. And if you look at our numbers, I mean, we talk a lot about the NDP being up a lot in the city, but the reverse is true as well. The Conservatives have a massive lead in rural Manitoba, and that really hasn't changed despite their overall popularity decreasing. And Dauphin and Interlake Gimli, if you look at the boundaries, I mean, they are, of the kind of seats outside the perimeter, they're the most rural. And I do think that, even though Dauphin, you might have a bit, there's been some things there that I think might, lead it to be more of an
the jail,
seat.
particularly.
Yeah, the jail and the incumbent MLA isn't running again, that sort of stuff. That's, but still, it's a pretty rural seat. And that's why I would consider it to be more of a toss-up. Interlake Gimli, same thing, different boundaries compared to when Peter Bjornson and the Gary Dewar era was winning that seat when it was closer to the city. Now it's way more rural. Whereas like Selkirk, St. Andrews, and even like Dawson Trail to some extent, even though
It's
I think that probably, essentially their capital region, their bedroom communities, and they are, in many ways, kind of just, like a lot of the other suburban seats we talk about.
Well, so I only mentioned 3 rural seats, but Dawson Trail I don't really consider to be a rural seat. I mean, that's another one that really captures so much bedroom community to Winnipeg. I think those people, like when they're thinking and talking about politics with their friends and family, they're talking about it from a greater Winnipeg area kind of perspective. Yes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, there's definitely a lot of that, a seat like that where I guess with Dawson Trail in particular, there is like St. Anne and kind of the more rural area a little bit further out. But definitely those communities that are just right up against the perimeter. It's not that different than say some of the ones, right at the, edge of Winnipeg.
So let's talk about the city then, because that is where there are more seats in the city. The NDP enjoy the greatest support and the greatest gap in support to the Progressive Conservatives. But I mean, it really, I wouldn't say, like to get into that low to mid 30s, they've pretty much got to run the table in Winnipeg. And it may turn out like it may get dangerously close to running the table if some of those seats that Gary Dewar was able to win. But let's talk Assiniboia, which again is not a traditional. It's not really a traditional NDP strong suit. Why could they be strong in Assiniboia?
The NDP's had Assiniboia in the past, right? I mean, they won it by 4 votes, I think, in 1999. It is kind of a older suburban area compared to some of the new parts of the city. But it's something where, I think it's going to be, I think either way, it's going to be contested pretty closely. It's been conservative for the last little while, but I mean, just you look at the demographics of that area, and it is, I mean, the NDP actually did perform relatively well there in the last election. I think they had they cut the plurality of less than 1,000 votes. So it is one that the NDP would be in a good position to pick up.
And it is a bellwether riding, as Assiniboia goes, so goes the province, one could say.
I've never heard that before, but we're definitely gonna say that more.
Trademark.
Now.
There you go.
I mean, Assiniboia is definitely close, but there's an argument to be made with Assiniboia as being sort of turned back to an NDP. And when we talked about Selkirk, I think that might be something worth talking about. But I think if you were to look at one riding, that would be a Winnipeg riding and is the turning point riding and the one to watch on the night. It would really have to be Southdale. Like, I think Southdale is such an important riding because it's Audrey Gordon's health minister. I mean, we know that we haven't really got to this part around what are the major issues that are going to be this election fought on, but everyone knows it's going to be healthcare. It's going to be the number one issue. And so in this election, I think watching Southdale and Audrey Gordon, who won pretty handily in 2019, winning by like 20%, would you agree that would be the one riding? Or I see some shaking of heads or.
I think it's one of the ridings to really watch. I think that I don't see how the NDP, if they want to form government, cannot win Southdale. But I would put in Winnipeg, I've got 3 or 4 other seats that I think are must wins if they want to form government.
Yeah, I think it's among that and maybe McPhillips. I mean, are probably like the lowest hanging fruit in terms. If the NDP don't do well in those seats, or it's very close even, they're probably not going to have a good shot of winning government, right? Just based on where their numbers are, I would think that those would be seats that they could pick up. I mean, for me in the city, it's probably a seat like Waverly or Fort Richmond, or maybe even like Radisson and Northeast Winnipeg. Those are the ones that I would say are probably my bellwethers, and the ones that I'm
Rossmere.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the NDP, again, they've had moments of great glory, Chris, haven't they, in that Northeast. Remember, I mean, Gary Durer, during his heyday, was sort of the king of Northeast Winnipeg, and in all of his, used to talk about how much time he spent going to watch his kids play volleyball and soccer. But it was also like, I think it was deliberate, like he wanted to show his face in that part of the city to let people know, they don't have to vote progressive conservative.
Yeah, you look at North American trends, and the right of center voters are in the suburbs, right? And so in Winnipeg, if you look federally and provincially, as you get to the outer ring, closer to the perimeter, you start seeing more progressive conservative support. And the closer to the core area, the stronger is the NDP support. So I used to think of the NDP support in the city as being north versus south. Gary Durer changed that, but also just the politics of North America changed. And so we look more at the donut around the city. That's where people have larger houses, complain about taxes, and they might drive pickup trucks and things like that. And whereas the core area tends to be more the working class. So that's one thing to think about is, so those areas like McPhillips, Assiniboia really means that the NDP is able to cut into that donut and that donut ring. And if they don't, like I said before, McPhillips and Assiniboia, if they don't take those, then it's a lost cause and the PCs will have held on to power.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things, I mean, sort of in that same vein, is that when you look at also, we talk about like Gary Durer and the NDP of that era going into suburban Winnipeg. The other thing that happened in 2016 when the Conservatives and Brian Pallister won big was they won a lot of seats in Northeast Winnipeg and sort of a traditional working class part of the city. They won Radisson, they won Transcona, they narrowly gave Transcona back in the last election. But that's why, like Radisson, Rossmere, some of those seats, which are, typically, a little more blue collar, a little more working class. That I think also when you look at the trends, North America wide or worldwide, I mean, that there's been conservative parties tend to appeal much more, to those kinds of voters. And so that's why I think, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about these areas as being potentially swing or hotly contested. Whereas, now a seat like Radisson or Rossmere, I mean, that's a big part of where that battle, I think, is going to be within the city.
Well, we also talked just briefly before we started about how, the Tories used to rule Southwest Winnipeg to South Central Winnipeg. But even now, like if you look at the census information that's coming, and that's broken down by federal riding, but Winnipeg South, which is such an enormous riding now that covers that almost that quarter of the city in the Southwest, is now the most diverse riding in Manitoba. So there are more people of different ethnocultural backgrounds in Winnipeg South than any other riding. And while you can't always these days associate diversity with either right-wing or left-wing politics, what it does mean is, the Liberals aren't as strong in St. Boniface as they used to be. It's not the St. Boniface of Ron Duhamel. This is not the Southwest Winnipeg of Gary Filmon.
And the number of new Canadians in Winnipeg is phenomenal. And if you think of the Filipino Canadian community in Winnipeg, that's something that wasn't really there 20 years ago. And so, and in some ways, the NDP has been very effective in courting the Filipino, like you think of the Marcelinos and their impact. But it'll be interesting in this election to see that, new Canadians, particularly first and second generation Filipino Canadians, what that impact will be on outcomes.
So this isn't the only difficult riding that I'll bring up, but I know this is the one that from a brief chat before we started recording, that's among the most contentious. So we should have dramatic scary monster music coming in now for the contentious portion of the podcast. Ready? Okay, thanks, Adam. Kirkfield Park. Okay, so that it is in the toss-up section, but not everybody thinks it's a toss-up. The guy who didn't do his homework doesn't think it's a toss-up.
No, I didn't. Because this is the one riding I think I know very intimately, and having seen and heard and had my daughter knock on the working in that campaign, it is such a strong conservative base riding that while close and perhaps should have turned, it seems like there is a hardcore set conservative vote within that riding. And then on top of that, and I think one thing we haven't done is when we talk about individual candidates, I think sometimes there are candidates that we perhaps may, I wonder sometimes when we talk about, for instance, we haven't talked a lot about, are there areas within the province that are really willing and open-minded enough to vote for a First Nations leader of a party? And this is worth discussing, but it's also worth thinking about because, in Kirkfield Park, we have an openly trans person who's running for the NDP, and that there are elements of Winnipeg that sometimes think about those issues when it comes to candidates. And Kirkfield Park is going to be something very interesting because I want to watch that on election night because I want to believe that there's a Manitoba that's ready to think about people from all different walks of life that can walk into politics and serve. But I also know that having witnessed what happens within the last campaign, although it was a by-election. I mean, by-elections are such a weird way to make a litmus test of anything, But I would be very interested to see what is the kind of Manitoba that we're looking for in the future that truly is representative and inclusive. And I think Kirkfield Park will tell that story.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but you and I, Chris, kind of see the NDP fixing the horrendous by-election performance, and regrouping. I mean, as much as anything matters, nobody really cares what I think is going to happen in Kirkfield Park.
I care.
Yeah, but I think the NDP will win. I think the only reason that they didn't win, I would say 25% of it was the fact that the PCs stumbled into a guy with instant name recognition who still had his mayoral billboards up around the city when the by-election was called, Kevin Klein. And the second thing was that they ran a horrible campaign. You've got, and I'll connect this to current events. So the Grace Hospital is smack dab in the middle of the riding. The Grace Hospital is a flashpoint for the debate on healthcare. And not just now. The events of this week have made it more so with the absolutely astonishing performance by the Premier and the Health Minister to deny the existence of a letter alerting them to problems at Grace Hospital, then acknowledging that the letter exists, and then suddenly ordering 200 more, almost trying to bribe the surgeons at Grace. I think this is where the Tories have a problem that will not go away. In 3, 4, 5 months' time, every candidate of every party that wants to steal that riding from the Tories is going to be standing out in front of the Grace Hospital. And you know what? It's not a defensible position for the government right now. That's got to have an impact.
Well, I would say one thing is if you looked at that last by-election, we don't want to hang on too much as an evidence of what's going to happen in the future, but is the Liberals. The Liberals and their impact on the outcome of that by-election was, I think, significant. So, and I think a number of close ridings, as the question will be, what will the Liberals be doing, and will they be pulling votes away? My thinking is that many voters will be voting strategically, and they'll say, do they want to kick the PCs out or don't they? And then they'll make a choice, in most cases, for the NDP. So, but I do think that places like Kirkfield Park, the Liberals will be the spoilers or not the spoilers.
Yeah, I think they're going to be a big factor. I mean, it's interesting. They performed very well. They had the Liberal candidate who's also running again in this election is a nurse at the Grace, and so that made a big impact, I think, in terms of talking about that. But what we've seen historically, and even in by-election, the Liberals always perform much better in by-elections than they do in general elections, and so I do think that Liberal support, and especially when you look at what our numbers are doing overall, that's probably going to go down a bit. And the question is going to be, where does that vote go? I mean, does that go net to the NDP because it's kind of like, about change? It could. I mean, I do think it's close, but I also do think that, there is a strong, to Niigaan's point, there is a strong base of conservative vote in that riding, and Kevin Klein does have a fair bit of name recognition and a following. And so I think that, compared to if it was just any sort of generic conservative candidate, they might be a little bit more trouble. But I think that's definitely something that would, have me being a little bit more hopeful about their chances in that riding.
So the last little bit of theory that I'll throw out again about what might happen in Kirkfield Park. So we talked about how the Liberals did really, really well and got equaled or did slightly better than what they got in the general election, which almost never happens. So that was 1,700 votes. I believe that actually probably, because of it connects to the 2019 result, I think that is the ceiling for the Liberals right now. So then you have Kevin Klein with 2357 and Logan Oxenham with 2196. So a by-election, I think, when the NDP decided or ended up running a bad campaign, mismanaged on ground level, E-Day kind of stuff, what they did is this result flatters the Tories. Because to win this in a general election, he's going to have to get at least twice as many votes or more to be competitive. Now, if the Liberal vote is staying the same, theoretically, then the real growth question is the NDP vote. My guess is that a lot of Tories stay home in Kirkfield Park and don't vote. They're not going to vote for the NDP. They're not going to vote for the Liberals. They're just not going to vote. And that's actually, even with the poll results, when you go back to 2016 and look at, Brian Pallister winning this thundering majority, it was because the NDP vote didn't switch. It just collapsed. Right? The people who had been voting NDP, some of them did vote Tory, some of them did vote Liberal.
I think people were kind of fed up with a lot of stuff in that particular election.
And they just didn't come out vote. And, I think, I think hard lessons learned in the by-election, NDP's got to be lean and hungry in Kirkfield Park. And I don't see Kevin Klein as dynamic a character as he is. I don't see where he doubles or more his vote total.
Well, here's a little factoid is back in 1970, when we were wee bairns, Ed Schreier was saying that for the NDP to do well, they need the Liberals to be strong. And that shows you how things have changed, because the Liberals would draw votes away from the Progressive Conservatives. So now we go, decades later now, and it's a different thing for the NDP to do well. They want the Liberals to be weak.
Yeah. Do you think that that this progressive vote, if we, I always have trouble using this term progressive when it comes to describing, people who are in that middle, kind of figuring out, am I interested more in a party that's interested in tax cuts or expenditures for social issues or along the ways? Riel is such an interesting riding because we just recently had Rochelle Squires on. And it is a fairly diverse riding. I also lived in this neighborhood, so I know the kind of social justice lean that this neighborhood has.
She's a very, very strong constituency MLA. She's a cabinet minister, but she works that riding super hard as the MLA too, which is, and that is a make or break, sort of quality. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, this is, I think too, when you look to that area that the Conservatives won back in 2016, I think that those who did come out were sick and tired of what the NDP had to offer, particularly the infighting that were taking place. But there is a socially conscious branch within the Conservative vote that leans very much towards thinking about funding hospitals, violence against women. So, and I think Rochelle Squires in many ways represents that area, that element of the Conservative Party. And so it's interesting that if there were to be a turn towards looking towards the Liberals, but maybe also the NDP, it would be in Riel. And I noticed that all of you picked Riel as leaning NDP.
Yeah. And I mean, the reason I would sort of see it as being leaning NDP is just because of, again, the demographics of it, kind of the overall trend in the city. I think your point about, Niigaan, about that, lean in terms of where people are at. I mean, I think the government the Progressive Conservatives have made a, very conscious turn towards that. I mean, it kind of goes against some of the other things, the other decisions that they made earlier, trying to sort of fit that vein of, being like, we're spending more on healthcare, we're spending more on schools, we're doing these sort of thing. And I think that, very much with the aim of trying to shore up some of those seats. I mean, it's certainly possible, but I do think that, Riel, compared to maybe some other ones in Southeast Winnipeg, like say Saint River or Lagimodiere, just might be a little bit more difficult for the Conservatives to hang on to, just because there is just typically a higher base of NDP support we've seen over there for a long time.
Well, I mean, like, what do you think about that? And I would like to hear your thoughts on, I mean, this came up a lot in last week's podcast when we were talking about Rochelle Squires, and while she didn't say as much, she said a lot. In what she didn't say about the first years of this government and versus the last few years of the government, and how the radical shift. And I mean, she used terms like an openness when working with the premier, a premier that listens more now versus before. I mean, she was absolutely telling us without telling us that there is a tone shift in the inner workings of the party, but also the external workings of the party. I mean, we just saw a massive expenditure into healthcare after years of cuts. We see funding with poverty-based organizations, which that would never have been heard of before under Brian Pallister. I mean, they cut the Neighborhoods Alive program, et cetera, et cetera. I can count all these different ways. Do you see the electorate in Manitoba as looking towards these two sides of the Conservative Party that have done a real radical shift over the past 2-3 years as being almost like a way to look at the party and go, I'm not sure where you're standing on some of these issues?
Well, I think Rochelle Squires, in some ways, she's a high profile cabinet minister. People saw Squires as a possible leadership candidate, and she decided not to run for leadership.
She was the candidate the NDP were the most afraid of.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
And then you think about where she's been on a number of positions. You use the term progressive. I would see her like a Roblin, a Duff Roblin type conservative. But I would say that the Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservative Party of Manitoba, has always had two elements in it. And we saw that in the Shelley Glover versus Heather Stephenson fractions within the party. And we saw that in the 1980s of Gary Filmon against Ransom. We saw it Sterling Lyon versus Spivak, if you want to go back to the 70s. And now we're seeing it in many ways in this election of Heather Stephenson moving the party away from its rural, cut taxes, low spending, that kind of hard-bitten side of the party. And the other side is the more progressive or red Tory side of the party, urban side of the party. So I think Rochelle Squires is very firmly on that side of the party. But we are seeing like all the money that's being spent right now by the Progressive Conservatives is just a sign of that faction of the party has taken over. And we'll see what's the fragment party that's just created. The Keystone Party, is it?
Yeah. Oh, no, don't talk about the Keystone Party.
Okay, okay.
That's in our next segment.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay.
Yeah. No, but I was going to say, like, and we ran an editorial this week pointing this out again, that,
Did you write it?
No.
Oh, okay.
I didn't. That's why I'm mentioning it with a clear conscience. But it was really the political value of tax cuts. So I would agree, and I agreed when Rochelle said it when she was on the podcast, that there's a change in tone. Yeah, there's absolutely a change in tone with the government. Heather Stephenson meets with people, goes out to events, shows her face. Brian Pallister went to movies by himself. Like, and that wasn't just, kind of a cute little factoid. That was the living embodiment of what he used to put on a baseball cap and sit in the back row of movie theaters. That was his idea of a good night out. He delegated.
They said Howard Pauly shot for gloves. That was his exciting venture at Eaton's. Anyway, I'm interrupting.
That's
Sorry,
okay.
Dan.
But, it's so change in tone. I absolutely buy that. But I think that there's still a battle for the soul of the Progressive Conservative Party going on. This year, $1.3 billion in tax expenditures. Tax cuts on tax cuts on tax cuts. Checks being mailed out all the time. They're spending $1 million just to send out property tax rebate checks. And the problem is, for anybody who's a real fiscal conservative and understands these things, it's lunacy. It's madness. We're supposed to be going into a period 2 or 3 years of recession or close to recession, but slow economic growth. And they are giving away, and it's going to get bigger, exponentially bigger every year. I actually think that when the checks start flowing, and this misguided idea that conservatives want tax cuts, that's really what conservatives want. No, conservatives want to know that they don't have to wait 2 years to get a knee replacement. And it's so every time they get one of those property tax rebate checks, all those people who are on the waiting, the tens of thousands of people on waiting lists are going to look at it and they're connecting the dots. I believe that they are connecting the dots.
Yeah, I think there's some of that. I think there are, there definitely are some people, out there who, want that sort of thing, want government to give them their money back, et cetera. But yeah, I think this does really speak to the tension that the conservatives have to deal with, right? And what they have to do to be able to win seats in suburban Winnipeg is to be able to, be relatively moderate. That's always where they've been relatively successful. And trying to, sort of bring it back, I think to try to deal with some of those things. That's the challenge for the conservatives, and where you are seeing this tension between, giving money away, the tax cuts, all this sort of stuff, but also trying to do the investment. And it is a little bit, kind of out of step, or, sort of figuring out, like, where does, if you're the Progressive Conservative Party in 2023, where do you stand after kind of going through all these different things in the last 7 years? The NDP have, to be fair, have a similar tension, right? Between kind of trying to be a little bit more, pragmatic and, focused on trying to, do the thing, the pocketbook things, the social service things that are going to win over those suburban voters. And then also, this is kind of, I think, what happened at the end of the Dewar-Selinger era, where, God became a little bit more about raising taxes and other sorts of issues that, they kind of got away on them. So, both parties have to, I think, navigate that and sort of really aim at that median voter in some of those suburban seats and what they want. And it's somewhere kind of middle of the road.
Arguably, though, that NDP is not the dominant NDP. Right now, the dominant NDP is very much on the social justice side of the party. And that NDP, I almost can't see who is leading that at any way. Maybe also this NDP hasn't been in government. The old NDP is gone with the past few years. Other than, Jim Malloway and, the old party wing has shifted to many ways this new party wing, which is untested, but also at the same time, I don't think is the kind of fiscal NDP that might be present. At the same time, we don't know, right? Because they haven't served time in the office. I want to ask one more question to our panel, because I think this is something that, we're doing this a little bit early in terms of how many months out.
Well, you have to have us back.
No, but the advantage is that if we're wrong, nobody will remremember what we said.
Exactly.
I think they'll all throw this in our face.
Yeah, this episode will mysteriously disappear from Spotify. So,
but the fact is that dozens of candidates have yet to be chosen. The Conservatives have 31 of 57 ridings. The NDP has 37 of 57 ridings selected for candidates. And I think to the Fort White by-election, and arguably the reason why the Liberals were so competitive in that riding, we could say the issues, but I think part of that is because Willard Reeves, longtime Blue Bomber, ran as a candidate in that riding, and I think had name value. And while Abi Khan is sort of known, I don't think in any way the kind of way in which Willard Reeves is known as an icon within the city. And so would you say that the last push towards candidates or selecting candidates will be a factor?
Yeah, I think it will to some extent. I think, Chris talked earlier about the three factors that people make their choices on, right? His party, his leader, and local candidate. And usually local candidate, I think it is usually further down in terms of what people make that decision on. It can make a difference, especially in a by-election, and that sort of thing. But I think, if you look at where the parties have nominated the candidates so far, they've really, obviously they're going to have their incumbents, but they've also really been targeting a lot of their, these swing seats, right? So far, in terms like the NDP already has bus ads out in North Kildonan, for the NDP candidate there. In different parts of the city that they hope to pick up. So, I think it will make a difference. In some of these, I think, they're also going to try to, announce certain people or keep their powder dry a little bit as we kind of get in closer to an election. But, I do think that's happening. And it will, I think it can make a bit of a difference, especially at the margins, especially in a tight race, depending on, what kind of candidate they get and then what kind of campaign they build out from there.
Yeah. To me, this election is going to be a little unusual in that, if you compare it to 2016, it wasn't really a fair fight. Greg Selinger, basically imploded the party. His decision to stay on was, I think we all knew, was wrong at the time. I won't speak for you guys, but I think it was a foolish decision, more personally or individually motivated than in the best interest of the party. But I have this very distinct memory of going to visit the NDP war room on Portage Avenue, and because they'd rented a couple of floors of an office building there, and going in and seeing these rooms and rooms and rooms of computers and telephones for all of the automatic dialing, push polling, whatever you want to call it, right? Voter identification. And there were like 3 people in there.
Yeah.
So they didn't have volunteers. In the end, when they started to see, for example, that a couple of long-held ridings that they didn't think were vulnerable were losing, they didn't have any resource. There was no money or resources to move into those ridings to shore them up. So the Tories were well funded. David McLaughlin ran a great campaign. They just, and Brian Pallister as well, like cracked the whip. He had all of his people selling memberships and raising money and, contributing money to the central campaign. So yeah, like they were better organized and they executed better. This time around, it's kind of hard to know exactly. Like the Tories have actually done pretty darn okay on fundraising. Maybe not as well as they have in the past, but they're pretty strong. The NDP have made a big rebound in fundraising, so they're going to have money before. But Kirkfield Park is, again, well, boy, we're going to beat that to a pulp. But part of the problem there was it is a new generation of people working in the back rooms. So all of the doer people, all the people with the institutional knowledge of that secret sauce that they use, then they're all gone.
So I would say that one of the things that Brian Pallister did for the party's benefit of the PCs was that he forced local candidates to rejuvenate their local thing. And if you weren't signing up members, you were getting...
You got the bison of shame.
That's right. And that happened out in my home
and
part
yes,
of
Brian,
Transcona.
there was a bison of shame. Sorry.
So Brian Pallister got the ridings reinvigorated in areas that needed to be reinvigorated. He also brought a diversity of candidates, and we forget that. But I would say that on the local candidate nominations, to Niigaan's question, and is that if people feel that their party has a chance of winning, that you will see some very good candidates running for the parties. If they think it's a lost cause, there'll be people who say they aren't going to be running. And we had the slight uptick by the probe poll, and we'll have to see if in the spring that uptick continues for the PCs. But look, if you are thinking of running, you have to give up your job for a number of months. Yeah. It's a big deal to, we saw Sherry Rawlins. She was thinking of running against Ben Carr for the federal Liberal nomination coming up for the by-election. And she didn't because, she has to sacrifice the sense of being a city councillor. I would say that if the PCs are looking moribund in the next poll, that we will not see some good quality candidates running for the PCs. But if the PCs look like they have a shot, then there will be a quality candidate stepping forward. And I think that right now we will be seeing, as these vacancies start being filled that you mentioned, Niigaan, that we will see easily some good quality candidates stepping forward because they feel that the NDP will be winning the next provincial election.
Well, I mean, what really prompts me to think about this a lot is because, if the Conservatives they're the most to pick at this point, or perhaps the most pivotal picks. I mean, if you've got 16 of your 57 ridings not selected for a candidate yet, some of those are in those rural ridings. And if we know what has happened in
yellow dog will do,
well, we know what's happened. Perhaps, I mean, that tension within the Conservative Party is really notable, but it's also notable in that if the biggest issue coming out of the pandemic was the fracture within the Conservative Party, and I don't want to take away the thunder of what we talked about with the Keystone Party, but that there is a hard right within that party. There's also a urban right or more progressive right. Yeah. Then who they put in those candidate spots will be pivotal. Yeah. Will be really pivotal because it will show it will signal to the urban voter that the party's turning hard right, which I think Stephenson has tried to do with most Conservative leaders, appease the hard right and then also appeal to the center right. And then if you appoint a bunch of candidates within the rural areas, which are so-called perhaps safe ridings, but yet that are, let's say, affiliated with movements like the Freedom Convoy and so on, then that's a tough move. That's a tough decision to be made as to who will be the candidate and what will that signal to the rest of the party.
Well, I think that's the inherent tension, right? And you have to look at it, I think, through a few different lenses, like in those safe rural conservative seats. And I think this is part of the reason, why I think it's been a little bit difficult for Heather Stephenson and others to kind of deal with that, is that the people who are most likely to be getting involved in a nomination race, or, the people who are going to be making those decisions and showing up to a meeting to pick someone en masse, are the people who are really, like the people who maybe got, involved in the Freedom Convoy, or who supported their aims, or, I mean, there is a really, it's a strong activist base. I mean, we've seen this in Canada, we've seen this in the US, where those are the folks that are kind of getting more involved. And interesting, in fact, I mean, most of the nominated candidates so far, a lot of them are actually also former staffers. Like they're people who work in the building who are stepping into some of these roles. They'll probably be the next crop of conservative MLAs.
The young Turks.
Exactly. And so, but in the city, I mean, in some of the ones where, in the contested ridings that they need to, the conservatives need to hang on to, that's where I think it's a little more challenging, because I don't know if they have quite the same infrastructure, and quite the same dynamics in terms of who's going to end up being the candidate and who's going to end up being involved. And that's what they have to kind of work through. So it's a little bit different, I think, with that versus in some of these, rural areas where that's what you're dealing with.
So interesting, and this is partly goes to what you just said, but also, Chris, what you talked about the things that Brian Pallister did. So he, and also David McLaughlin, I think, was big in this, established an actual dashboard, and where they would report on membership sales, other fundraising checks and whatever. And, if you fell below the line, you were summarily roasted at caucus meetings and whatnot. One of the first things that Heather Stephenson did when she came in, she got rid of the dashboard. And one part of it was that the dashboard lost credibility within the PC caucus because Brian Pallister wouldn't allow his ridings numbers to be put up on it. On the argument that, well, I'm off, doing, first minister things, so it's not fair to compare me. But of course, he wasn't doing that stuff either. So, but she got rid of it, and it was an interesting signal to the caucus. The caucus definitely wanted it, but it does harken back now to, like, David McLaughlin, his quote to me about the party that he saw when he arrived a year in advance of 2016 to help Brian with the campaign. He said that the caucus room we were less a team than we were a network of warring duchies. So they were raising money, like the best of them were raising money, solid constituency organizations, not sending money to the central campaign, not helping weaker candidates or ridings. So, but this all brings us to the X factor, small X or big X, Keystone Party, and I'll lump into the conversation, or, the activist far right libertarian conservatives, going after some nominations, how that constituency, through either channel, how big an influence are they going to have on conservative results when it comes down to it?
I don't think they'll have a huge impact. It'll only be, I think, in a few different ways. In terms of like gaining support or potentially winning seats, I don't see that happening because maybe they pick up a little bit more support in some really rock solid.
And you're talking mostly now about
the Keystone Party, yeah. So the Keystone Party. So that part of it, I don't see it necessarily playing out there. The only way I really kind of see this potentially playing out, and I guess we'll kind of see what happens. I mean, this is a little bit sort of peering into a really hazy crystal ball. But if you get some people who are nominated who maybe have said or done some problematic or contentious things at some point, and then the NDP makes a big deal out of it, saying, look, this is who's running for the Conservatives. This is Heather Stephenson's Conservative Party. You have to drop candidates. I mean, we see this. I think we've seen this most often, like in Alberta, right, where different UCP candidates have been dropped because something came to light. That's the only way I see that happening. But I don't see any real evidence so far of that.
So the Keystone Party I see comparable to the Confederation of Regions. I don't know if people remember the Core Party back in the late 80s. And they were very successful in New Brunswick. But,
You got lots of deep cuts today, Chris.
Sorry?
You got lots of deep cuts today, Chris.
Well, I'm wearing my Stephen Fletcher button for you. Like I brought it as a souvenir of past days
how
here.
did we miss that somehow? Like that's the metaphor for Stephen Fletcher's entire career. How did he get in here?
But I mean, like, far right independent parties, sometimes can have an influence. But I would say that like the Core Party, it will pick up some votes, in some safe conservative ridings here, like the People's Party in the last federal election. But I don't see the Keystone Party as having any impact on any of the constituencies on the outcomes.
But I mean, there are enough that Maxime Bernier is considering running in Manitoba in the next federal election. I mean, there's enough of a presence.
We had a
there.
vote after he left the province. We decided to pass.
But
respectfully,
he's looking
sir.
at Portage Liscott.
Yeah, well, in mentioning the Core Party, in 1988, the Core Party came second place in all southern federal ridings in Manitoba. And they came second place behind the Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservatives federally. So I think the People's Party, the same thing, is they a lot of noise, but there won't be any outcome.
So here's my I can't get over it. Every time I go to a Jets game, it's like True North. There's big, True North, and then when it comes to free, there's this smaller but still loud constituency that yells out free during that part of the national anthem, and it's it's an anti-pandemic restriction kind of thing. It's impossible to tell how many people are doing that. And of those people doing it, are they really serious, or are they just, I'm going to use up my profanity now, disturbers. See, I have to say something every episode so that Adam gets to hit the bleep button.
I'll make sure that the button is ready.
Yeah, okay, so disturber. So, but like, it's impossible to tell, which is very much like the Keystone Party. When that happens, though, here's the scenario that I see. I see the results in Fort Richmond. I see the NDP candidate winning Fort Richmond by 75 votes, and some wingnut from the Keystone Party getting 135 votes. Like, there are going to be some really, really tight races in the city, particularly in a lot of these. Like 100 votes, less than 200 votes for sure. All they have to do to kind of upset the apple cart is get 150 votes. And I think in most of these ridings, particularly in South Winnipeg, if a Keystone Party, if they register a candidate, I think they're going to get 150 votes.
Okay.
So, that'll be like, because we're going to do this again after the election. And we're all going to sit in a circle, like, kind of facing each other and do the patting on the back because we're so smart. No, but it'll be interesting to see. Like, I honestly, because I'm still not sure if that happened in the federal election. There was the federal Conservatives certainly thought they got pooched in about a dozen ridings where the PPC support was just enough to sort of keep them in second place, without really any knowledge of those people. Would those people have even shown up to vote for the Conservatives, right? But I do think, like, if 150 people vote and 75 of those were people who have voted PC in the past, in about 6 or 8 ridings in the city, that could be a big deal.
Question.
I think it's to be notable. I mean, only because I think that there's enough of a constituency that still has a kind of activist bent, and that they're curious to what is the remainder of that. And while the Freedom Convoy Part 2 didn't turn into what it was or expected to be, I think that there's enough of a constituency that wants to make an impact. And so I guess time will tell, and we'll see.
Yeah.
We did make some numbers.
Yeah, we did some.
And I have numbers too. So my homework is done.
So I'll reveal the totals, because in addition to asking our panel to identify safe seats and swing seats, then we asked them to do an overall prediction. And Curtis didn't do an overall prediction first, and then I asked him, and then he reluctantly agreed because he realized, like, this is a mug's game, right? Like, it's
Very much.
we shouldn't, like, so please be kind, listeners. Okay, but it is interesting, the results as they came through. So Curtis's prediction was NDP 29, PC 25, Liberals 3. And Chris Adams said NDP 30, PC 24, Liberal Party 3.
Off by 1.
Dan said NDP 29, PC 25, Liberals 3. And Niigaan says
NDP 28, Conservatives 26, Liberals 3.
Okay, so there is actually kind of a remarkable commonality. Like, we have some common thinking. It is, a majority is certainly, it's not improbable by any means. Mm-hmm. It's certainly not impossible. Nothing is. But it's not improbable at this point, is it?
Yeah, I think it's like, the thing is for the NDP, I think the ceiling, like, they can definitely win a majority. That's definitely there just based on the number of seats in Winnipeg and where things fall. But their ceiling is pretty low. And I think even, like I said before, some of those even, safe, NDP seats that we're thinking are safer, I don't think are slam dunks. And yeah, these toss-ups, they kind of have to run the table. And I think there are a lot of factors that have to come into play for them to be able to pick up all those seats. Like, they need to have good local campaigns. Things need to be kind of breaking in their direction, all those sorts of things. So, I mean, I don't think that saying the NDP are going to be in power as of October, I don't think we can say that's a slam dunk. And even if they do win, I think it's going to be pretty narrow, because I think the Conservatives, should still be able to win quite a bit of seats and definitely make this a competitive election.
I would say that, we have to remember, and I think people easily forget, like the era of the COVID, people vociferously angry at our governing PCs. And the question will be, to what extent is that anger dissipating in the electorate? And the people angry about senior citizens, angry about the hospitals, angry just about a whole range of things. And I just wonder, to what extent will people have forgotten that anger? And I'm thinking that many won't. And on the extreme right, of those who are like on the convoy side of things, the question is, does the Keystone Party have the machinery to identify and get those people out to vote? But I really do think I had 30 NDP in my prediction. I think that's a fairly straightforward prediction. To think that the PCs have been in power for 2 terms, well, shortened terms was the second one. Yeah. They went a year early into the election, but I think there are many ridings here that have historically voted the NDP. They just moved over to the PCs for a couple of terms.
Yeah. I think voter turnout is going to be a big issue for both the NDP and the Tories. When I talk to New Democrats right now, they are sick with worry. It's your fault, Curtis. It's probe research. You come out with these 30-point bulge in Winnipeg.
Shoot the message.
And all of a sudden,
shame.
The NDP war room, they all start getting images of all of their hardcore supporters, like, planning wedding showers on the election night or something, and not voting. So, I think huge leads are difficult in polls are difficult for parties to manage. Expectations are high, but that doesn't always translate into the kind of activity. And on E-Day, I think as well too, like, I do believe that my 29 is the under. Like, I think I'm actually I'm trying not to peg myself to a number that's indefensible, but I actually see a scenario where, especially in Winnipeg, combination of that, weird wingnut character taking 150 votes, and I see people not voting for Heather Stevenson, not voting for this government, not having anybody else to vote for, not voting. And, when that happens, if the NDP are good at managing their problem of expectations, that's when you start to see, things get bigger. Because remember, like, I don't think anybody thought Brian Pallister necessarily was going to win 36 seats in 2016. Like, I think they thought he was going to win the election, but he even out, and some of the seats that they won from the NDP were like, I mean, it was pretty odd,
even with the way Selinger ran the party into the ground. So I think that, but that is NDP traditional voters not showing up.
The not showing up part is going to be the pivotal point. And so I do agree that there's people watching the polls and wondering if apathy will be created. But, the issue of healthcare is such a personal issue and, arguably personal for me too. But it's such a personal issue that I wonder too if really all that's going to cure that is just a few well-placed ads and a reminder that both during the pandemic and after the pandemic, that this situation of healthcare is in such a dire position that it may be such that people feel such personally invested in wanting change. I think that apathy may be overcome, even if there is a big lead, because the issue is so personal for so many.
Well, it is interesting. In last week's newspaper, there was all that news about the Grace. The government tried to diminish the controversy over the orthopedic surgeons at the Grace by dropping an update from the Surgical and Diagnostic Procedures Task Force that they had made progress in reducing the wait list. And this has got to be one of the most qualified good news announcements ever. So there are now fewer people who are waiting ungodly lengths of time to get elective joint and cataract surgery. And the problem with that is that the wait list is still, there's still 100,000 people in Manitoba waiting.
Well, I think the cataract surgery has been mostly remedied, but
they're only Chris. They're only talking about reducing the number of people who were added to the wait list during the pandemic, not the number of people who were already waiting.
Yeah.
And
So I would say though, and I think we all agree, the two big issues are always education and health, and those two issues, and sometimes crime, but those two issues are really important to the middle class. And the middle class in Winnipeg are, in the suburbs, and I think the healthcare crisis will be swinging many voters over to the NDP.
Well, we want to do a big thanks to you both for coming by. We just a very invigorating and exciting discussion on something that you wouldn't think would be that exciting and invigorating.
This is all I live for, Niigaan. I really don't understand what you're talking about.
When you told me this,
you're talking to a political studies guy, a pollster, and a political columnist, and I didn't think it would be that interesting. Are you on the wrong podcast?
No, I thought it would be interesting, but I just didn't think it for maybe the listener. But I think that what we did is we gave the listener a big foray into Manitoba politics, also inside or outside of Manitoba. We have a lot of listeners outside of Manitoba. And I think what we gave them is a real sort of geographical landscape a few months out. But I think this election is such one to watch because it's not only our first one post-pandemic, but it's a pretty pivotal one, I think, that indicates some shifts in both parties that they're going to be facing.
Well, I very much enjoyed being with Curtis and the two of you, particularly being in the CJNU studios, which I really think are really nice to be in.
They're pretty spiffy. Yeah. We're almost afraid sometimes to tell people how nice it is here in case people want to come and have lunch or just sort of look from the other side of the fishbowl. Thanks to Chris Adams from the University of Manitoba Political Studies, Curtis Brown from Probe Research, Niigaan Sinclair from Parts Unknown.
In the city this week.
Woo! As a special treat. And I'm Dan Lett, and thank you very much
for coming out.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.